All right, so we are now into the second phase of our inductive Bible study, which is the interpretation.
Yep.
And the main thing about interpretation is what?
Is you're trying to use the observations that you made previously to then interpret the text. And you do that through asking questions and trying to think like, okay, so why is this mentioned here? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if I'm asking a question, how important is it that we find an answer? Like, because I feel like interpreting for me feels like we solved it. Like, we know what it means now.
Well, I mean, like, we want to be interpreting and trying to understand what's going on, but it doesn't end there, right? So the last part of inductive method is the application part and how it applies to us. And so something like that's helpful to think about when you're trying to figure out how important a question is to answer, or like, if you should answer all of your questions, is thinking about like what maybe could be the point of this text. Like, what maybe is this text trying to get us to see, or like what questions is this text begging us to ask? Okay. Right? So then, because those will lead us then into our application. Okay. And not to say that you should have an agenda when you're coming into scripture, but just thinking about like the importance maybe of like a place isn't as, and like the significance there, it might not be as important as like what Jesus is saying. Right. Something like that.
So if we're doing the Sermon on the Mount, mm-hmm. If we get like really tied into like what specific mountain it was,
yes, right.
That, while it has value, mm-hmm. It's more about the sermon, not
yes.
necessarily about the mount.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And I think you've already asked the first great question of like, what is this passage trying to tell us? Mm-hmm. Or what question is it begging us to ask? I think that's right. Such a good, like looking at this whole, like, what's the thing that like it wants us to be asking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
That. But let's go to our observations.
Yes.
And see what questions come up. Taylor, you said your first observation was you noticed it was the next day.
The next day.
So give us an example of a type of question that you could use with that.
Sure. So if it has the detail the next day, then my mind would think, okay, well, maybe something happened before this day. Because it's connecting it, saying like, well, the next day. So then you're thinking, well, what happened the day before this? Mm-hmm. And then we could maybe, look back and see if there's anything there. But right now we're just in the questions part. So right. Not doing that yet, but just saying like, what happened before this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sometimes when we're doing Bible studies, we can get really tied into the specific assigned passage. Mm-hmm. So this one is verses 35 through 42. The question of like, well, what happened the next day? That's going to force us to go backwards.
Yep.
So that we can understand what's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just good to remember that we have that permission
exactly.
To go back and forth with this.
Yes.
Another question that we asked, or observation that we saw,
yep.
was Jesus says, "Come."
Yes.
What kind of question does that draw? Would you come up with that?
Yeah, well, I would want to know, like, what is Jesus inviting them to? Like, Jesus is saying, come. Like, okay, well, where are they going? You know, and why did he invite them? Yeah.
So I think that was like 3 questions.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yep.
Right there. And one of the questions or observations I made was that they followed Jesus.
Right.
And so you correctly noted that it doesn't say they were interested in him. It just says they followed him.
Right.
And so one of my questions would be, why did they follow Jesus?
Yeah.
At that point, he hadn't even said anything to them.
Mm-hmm.
Were they interested?
Yeah.
Were they suspicious? Did they know something about him?
Right.
And so for me, I don't see, like, I feel like that could push me backwards in the text. Like, did something happen before this?
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of moves me to some different spaces in the text.
Yeah.
So to recap, we first start with our observations. What do we see here?
Yes.
And then with our observations, we just start asking questions about the observations we've made.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then the last phase of the inductive Bible study is application,
Yeah.
where we start looking at the questions we've asked and saying, what?
Well, we're starting to answer those questions too. So that's like a part of the interpretation is
Okay.
answering the questions. And then from that, we're trying to ask like, so how does that apply to us? And what can we learn from this passage? And how can we, then use it to become more like Jesus in the way that we live?
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move over to the application phase.